After the death of his wife, Jack and his mistress go to the notary to receive her inheritance. But instead of riches, a humiliating surprise awaits him. Rachel, knowing about her husband's betrayal, leaves all her assets and fortune to her son Tommy, whom Jack did not even suspect. Plans collapsed, and with them Jack's life. He loses everything and sinks into madness. In desperation, he decides to kidnap the child, but he is waiting for an unexpected turn of events that will put the final point in his fate. Do you want to know how it all ends? Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe. Jack and Rachel had tied the knot. To be honest, if she hadn't taken over her father's business following his untimely death, he wouldn't have married her. Her father was a vibrant and youthful businessman who had died suddenly of a stroke. Rachel, the only child and sole heir to the Monroe fortune, had become the focus of Jack's attention. A charming and seemingly carefree man, Jack thrived on the support of women. He intended to stay with Rachel until a better opportunity arose, but as time passed, he realized she was genuinely the gem of his life. Jack had become adept at managing her father's vast wealth, which she had inherited. Everything was going according to plan for him, and he believed that by playing on her deep love for him, he could effortlessly control her finances. The young woman was in severe mourning over her father, who had been her rock and the most important person in her life. Jack quickly positioned himself as her pillar of support during this difficult time. Before their marriage, the young and innocent Rachel had been unaware that Jack was carefully concealing his true self following the most painful experience of her life. Jack continued to behave impeccably, ensuring there was no turning back. In the days following the funeral, he proposed, suggesting they wait until the mourning period was over. Jack was a master of pretense, deceit, and manipulation. He could do whatever was necessary, transforming himself into whoever he needed to be. Unlike his previous relationships, where he hadn't invested significant effort into his affluent girlfriends, anticipating another wealthy woman around the corner, he saw potential with Rachel. He knew his efforts with her would not be in vain. However, the first challenge came from an unexpected source. Rachel's godfather, Mr. Langford, had been her father's closest friend and key business partner. Mr. Langford immediately noticed Rachel's unwavering devotion to Jack and suspected that nothing, not even his intervention, would deter her from getting married. Recognizing Rachel's grief-driven vulnerability, he persuaded her to request a prenuptial agreement. "It's just a formality," Mr. Langford explained. "Do you really think I need your money?" Rachel asked, repeating the godfather's words, visibly affronted. "It's standard legal protocol. It only comes into effect in the case of a divorce," Jack replied smoothly. "My godfather insists we should sign it. I trust him like a second father," Rachel concluded. Although Rachel had never been overly concerned about money, thanks to her upbringing, she wasn't easily swayed. Smart and determined, she pursued her goals relentlessly. Jack had no choice but to accept Mr. Langford's conditions. The prenuptial agreement strictly limited Jack's rights. It was evident that her father's company and all other assets would remain solely in Rachel's possession, with no division in the event of marital issues. Despite this, Jack hoped to gain access to her funds through shared accounts and accumulate savings for the future. He planned to siphon off money daily from the joint budget and transfer it into his personal accounts. However, Jack had underestimated Mr. Langford's vigilance. As the responsible manager of Rachel's finances, both personal and corporate, Mr. Langford ensured Jack had no access to her wealth. Despite limited personal funds, Jack remained optimistic, waiting patiently for better opportunities. His patience seemed rewarded when Rachel disclosed her desire to have a child. From their wedding day, she had been attempting to conceive. The desire to become a mother consumed her, yet each cycle brought only disappointment and frustration. She initially attributed her struggles to stress and her busy life. Managing the company had exhausted her, but she was determined to succeed. After over a year of unsuccessful attempts, Rachel sought professional help. Extensive medical tests finally revealed the truth. Her symptoms, initially dismissed as stress-related, proved far more concerning. Ultimately, the doctors diagnosed her with cancer. She endured hardship and therapy for almost 2 years, but to no avail. Jack only nominally served as a husband during this period. He had a vested interest in Rachel's apparent non-existence, which he was unable to conceal sufficiently. Rachel knew that her husband had cheated on her with other women, but they never discussed it publicly, because he effectively portrayed himself as the husband of a dying woman without raising any red flags. Jack believed he was an expert at conspiracy and manipulation. Feeling fortunate, he thought he just had to wait a little longer to get what he wanted. But everyone, including Mr. Langford and the nurses at the hospitals where Rachel was treated, condemned and talked about Jack's actions. The man was helpless and angry. On her deathbed, Rachel fervently wished to keep her marriage intact, but he failed to see why. The fact that Rachel had no will meant that her husband would be her only heir, which worried him as well. "That scoundrel will inherit everything," said Mr. Langford, "including the fruits of Rachel's and her father's labors." He was certain that within a few years, Jack, this spendthrift, would squander all the properties. But the old man didn't know how to bring up such a sensitive topic with his goddaughter, who until recently had exuded vitality and health and now had no chance. It would happen soon, and she was dying. Weeks remained until the end. Jack was already rubbing his hands in greedy anticipation. He was eager to lose his ailing wife and gain some good money, and his eyes were shining. He believed that the issue had been resolved. Mr. Langford hoped he wouldn't have to bring up the subject of the will himself, but thankfully he didn't have to. The conversation began when Rachel revealed a secret plan that left him stunned because she had carefully and ruthlessly planned every detail. He had no idea that retaliation could be served so coldly, and Rachel executed it flawlessly. Rachel's plan didn't take much time or effort to implement, but as she finished her earthly journey, she fulfilled her main goals. Unfortunately, Rachel died without making a full recovery, and her loved ones did not witness a miracle. She meticulously planned the specifics of her funeral before she passed away. Calm and determined, she expressed her last desires. The notary called the individuals listed in Rachel's will and invited them to the reading the day following the farewell ceremony. It was shocking news to Jack. He was positive that he would be his wife's only heir, as the law typically stipulates in such circumstances, and that she had not prepared any formal documents in case of her passing. Still holding out hope, he brought his new sweetheart, the gorgeous Stacy, to the scheduled meeting. Jack saw Rachel's friend Carl Tress and Mr. Langford as they entered the notary's office. However, he was surprised to learn that Carl wasn't alone. There was a boy in the stroller he was pushing. Jack had no idea that Carl had married or that the child had been born. Jack wasn't an expert in anything, but he wasn't a fool either, and he quickly realized that he had been deceived and that there was a hidden motive. Even though it was obviously clear that Rachel's plans would be extremely humiliating for him, his curiosity overcame him, and he wanted to know what she had in store. Everyone sat in various corners of the room in silence for about 15 minutes. No one else showed up. The notary began by explaining why they had gathered and that it was an honor to read the deceased's final will and testament, purposefully extending the introduction as much as possible. With a sly grin, the notary declared that neither he nor the others knew the contents of the will. Jack finally heard his name. "To my legal spouse, Jack, I bequeath nothing," the notary read, glancing at Jack after stating this brief and modest line and inquiring whether he had grasped its main idea. The only thing the embarrassed man could do was nod. Stacy grabbed his hand and tried to walk away defiantly, but Jack pulled her back and ignored her curious expression. He wanted to leave the scene of his public humiliation as soon as possible, but the invited audience had to stay for the entire proceedings. "I'll leave all my personal belongings to my only son, Tommy Tress, until he reaches adulthood," the notary said after a brief pause. "I designate Carl Tress, his father, and Mr. Langford as his guardians and executors." Jack was struck by a startling realization. "Car ils sont?" When his jaw dropped, he let out a startled cry. No one there was surprised by the news, except Jack and Stacy. "Is Rachel's biological child that boy?" Jack's voice rose as he gasped. "Indeed," Mr. Langford clarified. Tommy is Rachel's biological child with Carl. For the past 2 years, she has not been pregnant. That isn't feasible. Even though Jack knew that he didn't need to be pregnant to have a child these days, he clung to anything. The godfather grinned, obviously taking pleasure in Jack's surprise and disillusionment. The medical advancements of today are impressive, he said. As Carl watched this moment, he thought back to the agony he had experienced 2 years prior when he learned that his best friend was seriously ill and had little chance of recovery. He was surprised at how calmly she discussed her time constraints and her priorities. She then declared that she would do whatever it took to become a mother. I started treatment after preserving my eggs. I persisted even though they said I probably wouldn't be able to conceive. I know it's difficult to grow up without a mother, Carl, but I always felt your love and protection. Does Jack agree to raise the child alone? Carl questioned warily. Who would allow that? Since the child is unaware, I would be pleased to take on the role of guardian and spend his money, Rachel said. No, I don't even want to discuss my beloved spouse's response to my diagnosis and prognosis, since I've come to the conclusion that he has, to put it mildly, a fairly dubious character. I have no reason to be concerned about this individual. How is the infant doing? I want to talk to you about that. Rachel was usually brave, so this hesitation was really rare for her. I'm not sure how to gently bring up the topic. Perhaps there isn't a subtle method. She said in a high-pitched voice, I would like you to be the father of my child. Are you kidding? You have a husband, Carl said, obviously taken aback. Indeed, until the day I die, I will always have a husband. I've already decided on it. We won't sleep together, of course. Given my current condition, it's not feasible. Unfortunately, I am unable to carry the baby. I preserve my eggs, and now, of course, we need the future father's biological material. Thankfully, these services are now available, but we still require a woman to bear and deliver the baby. Carl initially thought this was ridiculous, the thoughts of a desperate woman, but she had a sensible plan in mind and had done a great deal of preparation beforehand. She located a surrogate mother for the unborn child, coordinated the services of a reproductive clinic, and investigated the legal ramifications. Carl, I might benefit from a donation service for the father of the child. I want to leave a piece of myself behind, but who will the child be with in the end? You are the only person I can trust, despite my many thoughts. I've known you for a long time, and I think you'll make an excellent father. I know you want to get married, start a family, and have kids. It makes sense, but please give it some thought. Don't respond right now. After what transpired with Jack, I believe that my child's father should not emphasize money and should not take advantage of my resources. I'm not as gullible as I was before getting married. I learned a lot from Jack. I have a great deal of life experience now. You don't require any money, in your opinion. For the first time, Rachel corrected her logic and said, You have plenty. You'll succeed, you know that. You put in a lot of effort to maintain the family business's success. Nothing was ever necessary for you. I can now be certain that a man who was raised in poverty will always worry about eating enough. And it will be a serious issue if his decency is likewise lacking. I personally witnessed this, the woman said regretfully. I must admit that I'm utterly perplexed. My concept of becoming a father was completely different. I must speak with my parents because I am unable to make such a decision on my own. I have to tell my close family members and ask for their viewpoint because I will need their assistance when I become a father. Rachel just asked Carl to pledge to keep the matter private. She had no objections. It was really hard to talk to Carl's parents. After listening to all the reasons and accepting everything objectively, his father promised to back his son's choice and provide the grandson with the best assistance he could. But his mother wasn't so accepting. She, like all mothers, wished for him to find a decent wife and start a family. Having known Rachel since infancy and greatly admiring her, she felt a great deal of sympathy for her. However, a mother found it extremely difficult to accept that her grandchild's mother was dying and that another woman would be carrying the child. Can the illness be passed down to the child? The woman dreaded this question since she thought it was awful, unprofessional, and inappropriate. But how was she going to protect her grandchild? Carl responded, Rachel doesn't have a hereditary form of the disease, which somewhat, though not entirely, reassured the nervous woman. After reflecting on it, She said she agreed with her son's decision. Carl also struggled with making decisions. He was caught off guard by Rachel's proposal, but after some thought, he decided there was no reason to say no. Rachel was overjoyed when he told her that he approved, and they began carrying out their plan one step at a time. As Carl contemplated the story that would change his life, Mr. Langford recalled the conversation he'd had with Rachel just over 2 months prior. She began by saying that she hoped Mr. Langford wouldn't refuse and that she respected him as a second father. She then revealed that she wanted him to be the guardian of her child. Mr. Langford initially thought his goddaughter was delirious. However, the godfather was stunned when Rachel told him the whole story. Rachel and Carl had kept their bold choice a secret for a very long time. "What is the baby's current age?" Mr. Langford asked. "Tommy is 8 months old." Rachel grinned. "You two certainly know how to surprise me," Mr. Langford exclaimed, still processing the news. "Before I pass away, I don't want Jack to find out about the child. He won't know until my will is made public. It's already with the notary, and I've already drafted it," she continued. "But there's still one issue that needs resolving. There will only be one father for Tommy. I've reassessed a lot in my life and don't want to take any chances. If something happens to me, Tommy will go to Kurt's parents. But I want you to also have rights, just in case," she added. The elder man, skilled at reading people, realized that acting this way toward Jack could be risky. "Rachel, are you sure you want to treat your husband this way?" he asked. "He's a despicable person. Meddling with your finances? Why, after all, do you need such vengeance from beyond the grave?" After expressing his thoughts, he immediately apologized. "I'm sorry for being so rude, sweetie. I've been thinking about this for 2 years, you know. I saw Tommy's birth, his parents' love for him, and Carl's affection for him. There's nothing else I need. I'll come to terms with it," Rachel replied. "These days, people who talk about miracles and cures really upset me. Regarding Jack, I had a great deal of affection and faith in him, but he proved to be the most ungrateful being. He acts as though working at the hospital is a difficult job. Did you know he came here with his girlfriends?" The elderly man nodded silently, his resentment evident. "Should I forget all this too? No, I'll punish him this way because he values money more than anything else. He'll be in for a surprise. Just wait and see. I didn't tell you about anything. It was very challenging. I want to show you my son, but I was very careful not to let anyone find out accidentally and tell Jack. I might be saying goodbye to him now," Rachel said softly. "I even wrote a letter, which will be delivered by the notary." Mr. Langford tried to talk his goddaughter out of it multiple times. He thought it was a bad idea, but the woman refused to back down, so he had to relent. It was her last wish, after all, and it should be respected. Everyone in the notary's office was lost in thought during the sudden silence. Of course, it's obvious to anyone who isn't a seer that Jack cursed Rachel in every way imaginable. Individuals like him are unaware that they could be at fault and that others' actions might be a reasonable response. But for these types, such contemplation is too complex. Why even search for issues within oneself? The silence was oddly broken by Stacy. She attempted to lead her lover out by grabbing his arm. But Jack wasn't going anywhere, since he still had more to say. "Do you really believe that I have no rights? Not even a required share or something like that?" the man yelled. "After all, I'm the husband." Such behavior made even Stacy cringe, not to mention the other people. Only the notary, used to such displays, showed no emotion. "You are not among the group of persons who are entitled to a share of the inheritance, as stated in the will. I also read your marriage contract very thoroughly," the notary responded. In front of him, the notary placed a large packet. "Even if you appeal to the courts, you have no chance, despite your right to do so. I'll argue this. The identity of this illegitimate child remains unknown," Jack rambled, unaware of what he was saying. Carl struggled to resist hitting the arrogant man. Anger made even the typically composed Mr. Langford flush. The notary alone remained as composed as a python. Nothing caught him off guard. This was just another ordinary workday. He answered coolly. "The child's birth certificate and medical records, which provide precise information about his birth, are included. Additionally, the DNA test results confirm that your wife is Tommy Tress's biological mother, in accordance with the deceased's wishes. I have to tell you that every document was carefully and painstakingly collected. Am I able to see? Jack asked, wanting to view the evidence. No, only the portion that concerns you may be reviewed. Naturally, parental permission is required before sharing any other documents, especially those related to the child. I don't give permission, Carl interjected immediately. In a legal proceeding, it would only be feasible if the court determined that the documents were necessary. For Jack, that was the final straw. He vowed not to let the matter rest and ran out of the office, slamming the door behind him. But his boyfriend was more courteous. After saying her goodbyes, she quietly left, shutting the door behind her. Does the fact that he did not sign the will after it was read to him matter? The notary asked Mr. Langford. He's not unique, replied the notary. It was really just a formality. If it weren't so depressing, it would be humorous. Mr. Langford spoke aloud. I still don't understand how Rachel got involved with him, though his question remained rhetorical. The men shook hands and quickly signed the required paperwork. Carl secured tiny Tommy into the stroller with the help of Mr. Langford. Would you like to come along? I want to go for a walk and get some fresh air. It's good for the baby, Carl said. Of course, I'll stay with you for a bit, Mr. Langford replied. They strolled silently, listening to the sound of the stroller's wheels. Do you think Rachel would be happy with how I'm handling things? At last, Carl asked, explaining what had been troubling him. She would be, I'm sure. Rachel's godfather consoled him. You're a great father, and it's clear how much you mean to each other. To tell the truth, I can't stop thinking about one thing. I believe Rachel told you that I cautioned against what happened in the notary's office. How Jack learned about Tommy and this entire circus surrounding the will. In response, Mr. Langford nodded. Of course, Carl said. It was me who kept bringing it up in conversation. This idea didn't appeal to me at first. He's a horrible person, mercenary, foolish, and angry. Why provoke him? To be honest, I considered telling him that Rachel was hiding a lot after the baby was born, but I didn't think it was my place. I concluded that she simply didn't want to deal with him herself and left us to handle these arguments. I saw him today, shamelessly, with that woman. I now wonder if I was right not to insist on my position. His reaction and expression were appalling. Getting rid of him sooner would have been better. I believe Rachel didn't want that either. That was a factor, too. And regardless of what she said later, she wanted revenge because she had a deep, twisted love that had nowhere else to go. Poor girl. A tear ran down the old man's cheek, and he wiped it away. She is not our concern anymore. She requested that we refrain. She asked that we give all of our love for her to Robbie. Rachel's godfather was comforted by Carl. Jack watched from his car as the men discussed the same topic. So, nothing will be given to you, correct? The girl asked incredulously, blinking rapidly. You're a fool. You've heard that this outcome means there's no chance, correct? Come on. At the very least, let's take something valuable and bring it to my flat. When Carl eventually mustered the courage to visit Rachel's house 3 days later, he found it deserted. He had even hired 2 bodyguards to defend him and brace for a showdown. But Jack had won the lottery and gone home, naturally taking many of the valuables with him. As expected, Jack sat alone in his small apartment's tiny kitchen, drinking whiskey Stacy had left him. Why would she need a poor man? Jack mused, reflecting on his situation. He found himself thinking about how he ended up there. Women used to pay to be with him, but now he had to give a young, attractive woman money to stay with him. Ironically, Jack, a fallen gigolo degraded by his vices and past his prime, didn't hold himself responsible for his plight. In his mind, his wife was the villain who drained his energy, shattered his dreams, and deprived him of the legacy he had long hoped for. In his imagination, he was still young, attractive, wealthy, and successful. However, Stacy delivered one final blow with some harsh truths. He was not needed. He was truly a destitute alcoholic living in delusions of grandeur. Accepting this fact proved incredibly difficult. His aspirations for success and fortune, which heavily depended on his ex-wife, collapsed like a house of cards. His hopes of becoming a prosperous businessman were dashed. His vanity blinded him to his own role in his downfall. Instead, he placed the blame squarely on his late wife. Jack conveniently ignored his numerous failed relationships, his alcoholism, and his contemptuous behavior toward his ex-wife, convinced that he was a saint who had never abandoned his ailing spouse. He kept thinking, "I can't hit her, and it's a shame she's dead. I was so certain that my patience would be richly rewarded that I hardly held back." Jack drank excessively for almost 2 weeks in an attempt to escape reality, and his animosity grew each day. He decided he'd had enough on a bleak, hungover morning. He realized that drinking wouldn't bring him success or allow him to exact revenge on Rachel. A few days prior, Jack had been utterly humiliated. When men sent by Mr. Langford arrived, they essentially coerced him into relinquishing the car keys, nullifying the power of attorney Rachel had granted him. "Didn't you realize that when the person who issued the power of attorney dies, it loses all legal force?" one of the men remarked disparagingly. Sober now, Jack began contemplating his next move and how he might exact revenge on Rachel. At first, he considered desecrating her grave, but after reflecting on what Rachel cherished most and what would hurt her the most, he settled on Tommy as an alternative. This thought struck Jack like a bolt of lightning. When he finally devised his plan for retaliation, he chuckled viciously. There were numerous details to resolve and organize, but he focused on the most critical aspects. Tommy wouldn't be physically harmed by him. What is a mother's greatest nightmare? Being unable to help her distressed child. Jack made the cruel decision to do exactly that. His agitated mind devised a simple strategy. The baby would be abducted, taken far away, and placed in an orphanage. If his plan succeeded, Jack imagined feeling a sense of fulfillment after weeks of plotting and dreaming of vengeance. It had been a long time since he had smiled like that. Indeed, such a gaze was frightening and menacing. But Rachel's former husband seemed unfazed. As he pondered every detail, one might even say he felt content. A wave of euphoria washed over him. Although his target was far away, Jack couldn't help but envision the anguish Rachel would experience knowing she couldn't assist her child. After making a theoretical decision about the plan, he began considering its practical aspects. To select the ideal location and time for his crime, he needed precise details about Tommy's whereabouts and who took him out of the house. Jack had visited Carl's parents' home before and knew them well from earlier days. He was also aware of the heightened security in the affluent suburban neighborhood. As Jack started reviewing his strategy, he became acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Undeterred by the difficulties, Jack remained resolute in executing his plan. For days, he observed the child's daily routine and movements from the forest using binoculars. Does the game have any value? Jack asked himself. Of course. Following the declaration of his plan, his mental state visibly worsened. He chuckled maliciously and whispered, "She ruined my life, and I will ruin her son's life." Someone who had been indifferent at the time might have noticed Jack's dramatic behavioral changes and persuaded him to seek help. Regrettably, speculation has no place in this story. Jack never abandoned his objectives. He followed through on his plans, despite how irrational they appeared. He scoured the entire area for the perfect vantage point to spy on Carl's house while remaining inconspicuous, spending days setting up the necessary conditions. For over a week, Jack would rise early and head to the settlement, where he would remain until late at night, meticulously observing and documenting every detail of the household activities with binoculars. He kept a journal to ensure he didn't miss anything. Through his observations, Jack learned that Carl's mother and a nanny were responsible for the child's care. However, Jack's plans weren't meant for Carl or his mother. They both recognized him immediately and knew him well. Jack was plotting a crime and had no intention of getting caught or punished. Anticipating potential police inquiries, Jack meticulously prepared his assault to avoid detection. The nanny became the focus of his plan. She followed a predictable routine, walking Tommy along the same paths every day. On a Wednesday, as the nanny took the baby for a daytime stroll, he was sleeping soundly. Jack considered himself lucky. She ventured beyond the town's safe perimeter and followed a narrow forest trail to a clearing where another nanny from a nearby settlement greeted her. Jack had heard them laughing as they conversed. He decided to cease his daily surveillance of the settlement and visit only on Wednesdays, aligning his visits with the nanny's routine to avoid drawing attention. It was as precise as clockwork. Every Wednesday, the nanny walked along the forest trail, leaving the settlement's protection. For 4 consecutive Wednesdays, he observed the pattern to ensure it remained unchanged. He knew he would return the following week at the same time to retrieve the child on the 4th Wednesday. To execute his plan, he paid cash at a nearby market for a powerful taser to avoid leaving a trace. To prevent being photographed, he meticulously planned every detail. Similarly, he purchased an old car, removed its license plates, and mounted them on another vehicle. He parked the car close enough for a quick escape, but far enough to avoid suspicion. He also considered his appearance, taking steps to conceal his face and body to avoid recognition. His thoughts often turned to kidnapping. These thoughts consumed him day and night, even manifesting in vivid dreams about the deed. As the appointed day approached, Jack lost about 7 kilograms and became a shadow of his former self. One glance revealed him as a man to be feared. Signs of fixation and neurosis began to appear on his face. On Wednesday, he parked in a designated spot and waited. He shuddered as he saw the nanny pushing the stroller along the walkway. The meticulous preparation distracted him from the reality of his impending actions. He planned to approach the stranger, use the taser on her, take the child from the stroller, and flee to his vehicle. In Jack's mind, the scenario seemed like a scene from a video game. But everything was real. The stroller, the mother, and the infant. The baby curiously surveyed the surroundings. Jack, by nature a non-aggressive person, struggled to cross this line. However, his intense hatred for Rachel compelled him to carry out his plan. He approached the babysitter, shoved her out of the pram, and knocked her down. She fainted from the shock after he used the taser on her. All that remained was to take the child from the stroller and run to the car. But this is where things went wrong. As he bent to loosen the belts, he was struck on the head and fell to the ground. Looking up, he saw an old man standing over him, tying his hands and scolding him. Jack passed out once more. The mysterious individual turned out to be a well-known forest ranger in the affluent neighborhoods nearby. His ranger house, often concealed by thick vegetation and unnoticed by Jack, was essentially midway between 2 neighboring communities. That day, as Mr. Turner returned from the neighborhood grocery store, he noticed unusual activity. He later told the police, "Despite the morning heat, I saw someone dressed entirely in black standing guard. I decided to observe and investigate for a while." Mr. Turner continued. As a seasoned forest ranger, he skillfully moved through the forest silently to avoid disturbing wildlife. He hid behind a tree and watched intently. "I saw a man suddenly attack a woman and knock her to the ground," Mr. Turner recounted. "He seemed to be going for the child, but at first I thought he might just be robbing her. Just in case," he added, "I ran and hit him with a stick I picked up. Congratulations, Mr. Turner. You're now a local hero. Look, the media is already gathering. They want to interview you." A police officer remarked, "Sign this police report and enjoy your newfound fame." "I won't visit them," Mr. Turner calmly said. "I don't care for that kind of attention." He took a detour back to his house to avoid being followed. In Mr. Turner's view, he had done nothing extraordinary. He believed anyone in his position would have done the same. How could he not help when people unable to protect themselves were in danger? A few hours later, Carl arrived at Mr. Turner's house. "Hello. The boy you saved today is my son's father. He's a decent young man. When I picked him up, he quieted down immediately. What a brilliant and courageous young man. Thank you so much. You were lucky to arrive in time." On the verge of tears, Carl added, "We're extremely grateful you didn't just walk by." He had been deeply affected by the intensity of the day. "How can I thank you?" Carl asked. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Turner replied, "You don't owe me any thanks." When he received gratitude for his deeds, Mr. Turner was truly taken aback. But Carl pressed on. "I would like a new hunting suit and possibly some food for my dog, though, if you insist." "No problem, of course," said Mr. Turner. "If it's all right with you, may I ask if this was all done for financial gain?" The inquisitive forest ranger inquired. "Unfortunately," Carl replied, It's much more complicated than that. Well, if it's not too much trouble, feel free to share. I feel like I'm living in a bit of an information vacuum, Mr. Turner urged. Carl began recounting the disjointed events of the previous few years. Rachel's illness, the unusual paternity ruling, her eventual passing, and the retaliation against her husband. According to the investigator, Jack was deeply distressed because everyone believed his actions were driven solely by money. Retaliation consumed him, Carl explained. When Mr. Turner inquired about this intricate tale, Carl felt relieved. He wanted to tell someone about it, to get a stranger's objective opinion. He questioned whether their actions had driven Jack to seek revenge and spiral into madness. Carl wouldn't have suffered as much if it had been about him, but everything he and Rachel did came back to haunt the boy. After finishing his story, Carl added, "Do you think we pushed him to this point?" Carl asked, turning to face the unbiased observer, Mr. Turner. "Does his drive for vengeance stem from us? What a boy. Are you serious? Why are you spouting such nonsense as an adult? You always had good intentions behind your Jack. He didn't need one at all. He abused his ailing wife, cheated openly, married for financial gain, and told himself it was all her fault. It was her fault for not persevering, for losing patience, and for retaliating eventually. Oh, she hid his pocketbook, which hurt him the most. On the other hand, Mr. Turner continued, the woman came up with a plan and carried it out. Carl's mood greatly improved when Mr. Turner responded with hard truths from the perspective of a stranger. Carl carefully considered everything Mr. Turner had said. "I now owe you for your wise counsel as well." Carl grinned back. They bid each other farewell, like friends, after the forest ranger simply waved his hand at him. Mr. Turner said he would check on the boy. "I've heard they say, if you save someone's life, you're permanently responsible for them. So, don't worry about Tommy." The forest ranger said goodbye. "I'll look after him here too." As promised, he frequently visited Carl and was always made to feel welcome. The boy found another devoted family member in him. Meanwhile, the court sentenced Jack to several years in prison. Everyone in the household was able to relax and resume their normal, peaceful lives during this extended time. At last, the family could breathe a sigh of relief. Mr. Langford cared for the boy during his many visits, faithfully carrying out the tasks his goddaughter had entrusted to him. Tommy's kindergarten class included a single mother whose daughter Carl met. The children got along well, and Carl's parents hoped that Tommy would have a sister, possibly more than one, and a loving stepmother this time around, as well as a thriving personal life for their son. Naturally, though, Carl would never let Tommy forget his mother, as he had promised Rachel. He talked about her often, showed the boy videos and pictures, and never stopped telling him how much his mother loved him and how she was always there for him, protecting and taking care of him, even if he couldn't see her.